Imagine stepping into one of the most lavish palaces ever built by mankind. Gilded halls, colossal crystal chandeliers, hand-embroidered silk carpets from the East, and noble ladies draped in gowns that could cost as much as an entire city's annual budget. Versailles, the heart of 17th century European power, stood as the ultimate symbol of beauty and aristocracy. But don't breathe too deeply, because beneath the layers of silk and powder lies a truth few dare to imagine: the stench of unwashed bodies, human waste flung from windows, wigs crawling with lice, and childbirths treated like public performances. This isn't a fairy tale. This is history, raw, haunting, and nowhere near rose-scented. In today's video, we'll dive into the 5 worst hygiene practices of royal women, the very figures who embodied the grandeur of an empire, yet lived in conditions that would make even the modern commoner shudder. To understand why Versailles, a place once hailed as a heaven on earth, carried such an overpowering stench, we must begin with something that seems obvious to us today: bathing. In the 17th century, cleanliness wasn't common sense. In fact, it was considered dangerous. Today, we bathe to protect our health. But in France during Versailles' Golden Age, the act of bathing was viewed with deep suspicion. According to Dr. Marianne Lemoine, a historian specializing in French court culture, the 17th century concept of cleanliness had nothing to do with water. It was about maintaining the balance of bodily fluids, a medical theory that dated back to Hippocrates. To royal physicians of the time, water, especially warm water, was believed to open the pores and make the body vulnerable to polluted air and harmful vapors. For that reason, full-body bathing wasn't just discouraged, it was considered reckless. Queens and noblewomen didn't bathe simply because they believed it could kill them. Dr. Lemoine emphasized, even for those who questioned such dubious theories, access to private bathing was nearly impossible. Versailles offered no individual bathing chambers, and the idea of daily showers was seen as not only extravagant, but almost indecent. Instead, aristocratic women used small cloths, not soaked in water, but often dampened with wine, vinegar, or even saliva. They would dab gently at their necks, hands, and faces more ceremonial than sanitary. A noblewoman might lightly pat her wrist with a cloth moistened in wine, not to cleanse it, but to emit fragrance strong enough to mask her body odor, explains Professor Elaine Duchamp, author of Behind the Powder: Hygiene in the Age of Opulence. On the rare occasion that a full bath did take place, it was far from luxurious, often chaotic and communal. Entire families would bathe in the same tub, following a strict hierarchy: men first, women last. By the time it was the queen's or princess's turn, the water was cloudy, cold, and filled with the grime of everyone before her. And even beyond the filthy water, the idea of proper bathing simply didn't exist. Soaps were made from crude animal fat and sometimes mixed with overpowering perfumes like ambergris or musk, leaving the skin not exactly clean, but coated in a pungent, greasy film. Why? Then, did they accept this? The answer lay not in science, but in religion. At the time, the Catholic Church warned that bathing could awaken lustful desires and open the door to sin. Public bathhouses were condemned as places of moral decay. For royal women, seen as embodiments of virtue and chastity, bathing was no longer a matter of hygiene, but of moral identity. The less they exposed their flesh to water, the more spiritually pure they were believed to be, notes historian Florence Della Roche. Of course, that didn't mean their bodies were clean. Quite the opposite. Versailles, was a place where body odor was expected, even normalized. To mask the smell, heavy perfumes became indispensable, applied to hair oil, body powders, and even the inner linings of dresses. But no perfume can hide everything. Forever. Foreign visitors to the palace often wrote about the shocking reality in their travel journals. I was overwhelmed by the smell of mildew, animal fat, and human bodies that hadn't bathed all summer. Versailles is magnificent if you only look and never breathe. I, Count Wilhelm von Rehberg. Germany. If the fear of bathing was surprising enough, imagine this: Versailles had no toilets. In the next section, we'll uncover a shocking truth. How did an entire royal court relieve themselves across thousands of rooms without a single functioning toilet? They called Versailles the heart of European civilization. But behind those gilded walls lay a foul truth. Versailles had no toilets. Celebrated as an architectural marvel of the 17th century, the Palace of Versailles housed hundreds of rooms, thousands of residents, and virtually no fixed toilet system. According to architectural researcher Jean-Paul Lefebvre, who led an archaeological excavation at Versailles, we discovered that for nearly the first century of its operation, Versailles functioned with almost no underground sewage system. Everything was handled in a way that was profoundly human, yet profoundly inhumane. In such a setting, the chamber pot, a portable commode, became an essential item for every noblewoman. These pots were discreetly tucked beneath beds, behind curtains, or inside intricately carved ebony cabinets, sometimes even draped in silk. For added elegance, when nature called, aristocratic women would use the pot right there in their private chambers. Even while dressed in layers of fabric, the sounds, the smells, and the awkwardness were considered a personal matter. Until a servant entered to remove the waste by hand, servants didn't just clean. They were the living sewage system, remarked Dr. Isabelle Rochefort, a historian of royal domestic service. But worse still was when no one came in time. Instead of discreet disposal, people would toss the contents out the window, straight onto the marble courtyards below. If the wind picked up, or someone happened to walk beneath, the consequences were beyond words. Travelers of the era documented their horror in memoirs. I was walking down the corridor when I saw a trickle of liquid seeping between the stones. I looked up and narrowly avoided a direct hit. Paulo, Count von Lichtenberg. Journal entry. 1704. The problem became so widespread that a royal decree had to be issued in 1715, mandating that the palace corridors be cleaned at least once a week. Once a week, not daily. For Versailles, this was considered a major improvement, said Professor Dominique Laroux, a historian specializing in royal domestic life. But the problem wasn't just where people relieved themselves, it was what they used to clean afterward. The 17th century had no toilet paper. Royal women used whatever was available: scraps of cloth, leaves, dry straw, and in desperate cases, their bare hands. Washing afterward? Not guaranteed. Some wiped their hands with cloths soaked in alcohol or perfume. Many didn't wash at all. The same hands that held a goblet of wine, adorned with ruby rings, were the very same hands that wiped, wrote Florence Delaroche in her study, Etiquette and Excrement. Some individuals, especially men, didn't even bother with chamber pots. They urinated off balconies, in the gardens, or directly onto the palace walls. The halls of Versailles became makeshift restrooms, unspoken but widely used. Noble women, gliding through opulent corridors, lifted their skirts not only to flaunt embroidery, but to avoid stepping in human waste. We speak of Versailles as a symbol of elegance, but for many women at the time, it was a place of constant risk, not just political, but physical, observed Dr. Lemoine. And yet, in ironic contradiction, lavish banquets continued night after night, with expensive gowns sweeping across unclean tiles, sometimes just feet above the very room where someone had relieved themselves moments earlier. Versailles shimmered beautifully by candlelight, but by morning, it reeked. They had no toilets, but they had hairstyles taller than their dignity. In the next section, we'll uncover the towering wigs, not just a symbol of fashion, but a warm, welcoming home for thousands of tiny, crawling creatures. At Versailles, height wasn't measured in meters, but in hair. In the 17th and 18th centuries, hairstyles were not just fashion statements, they were political declarations, social weapons, and unspoken symbols of power. The towering wigs, known as perukes, became an essential part of court attire, especially for noble women, and they were far from simple. These structures reached up to 2 feet, nearly 60 centimeters, and were reinforced with wire frames, cotton stuffing, fabric scraps, dried flowers, and sometimes even miniature ship models, tiny gardens, or early versions of the Eiffel Tower. Each wig was a miniature stage where power and vanity intertwined, said Professor Colette Baron, a specialist in French fashion history. To keep these massive creations upright, women used a type of pomade, a thick hair paste made from beef fat, pork grease, and fragrant oils. This greasy coating served 2 purposes: to hold the shape and to emit a strong scent. But the result? Lice. Lots of lice. Many women at court carried hundreds of lice in their hair without even knowing it. Noted Dr. H. Ling Dupont, an 18th century medical historian. To maintain these hairstyles, wigs weren't removed frequently. Some women kept them on for 10 to 15 days straight, even sleeping upright to preserve the structure. During that time, lice would nest, breed, and build an entire micro-community atop their heads. And so emerged a new grooming ritual, a tool culture of its own. The lice claw, an elegant scratching instrument. These long silver sticks, with a tiny hook at the end, they were used to scratch the scalp underneath the wig without ruining the hairstyle. Often tucked into a sleeve or bodice, noble women would gracefully retrieve it mid-dinner, give their head a discreet scratch, then sip their wine and smile. Watching a duchess scratch her scalp at a Versailles banquet wasn't impolite. It was part of the culture of living with infestation, explained Dr. Duchamp, author of Itchy Queens and Powdered Lies. Some wigs were powdered with talc to give that iconic white hue and absorb oils. But talc was also highly flammable. And yes, wig fires were real. As noble women passed by open flames in candlelit corridors or sat too close to chandeliers, their powdered coiffures became fire hazards. At least 3 documented cases from the 18th century describe women suffering severe burns from wig fires. Yet they continued to wear their wigs taller, more elaborate, and more dangerous. According to the Versailles Museum, Department of Royal Furnishings, and the damage wasn't just fiery. Many noble women suffered from chronic neck pain or spinal misalignment due to the weight of their wigs. Some had to wear support structures hidden in their gowns just to keep their heads upright while walking through the palace. So why endure it? Because to ignore the Versailles hairstyle trend was to erase oneself from the map of power. In this world, the appearance was a passport to privilege. And even if the wig housed lice and disease, it remained the crown of the aristocracy. To them, pain was the price of beauty, even when that beauty crawled, said Professor Baron. They wore masterpieces made of beef, fat, and lice on their heads. But when they sat down to dine, the real danger didn't come from their wigs. It came from the very food they were about to eat. In the next section, we'll explore the kitchens of Versailles, where parasites and sewage shared the menu at every royal feast. The banquet tables at Versailles were a perfect display of extravagance, from honey-glazed roast pheasants and pastries adorned with 24-karat gold to fruits sculpted like miniature artworks. But beneath the splendor lay a stench of truth, the smell of rot, rat droppings, and backflowing sewage. While the palace corridors were lined with red carpets, the kitchens of Versailles battled rats, insects, and broken drains every single day, said Dr. Adrien Moreau, a royal food archaeology specialist. According to the writings of Claude Frenois, a royal chef in 1712, sewage regularly flooded the kitchens due to a weak drainage system. Heavy rains often caused waste from upper floors to gush down, sometimes right into the Queen's private kitchen. One day, we were preparing pâté for the princess when black water spilled across the floor. The head chef simply said, "Carry on. Do not stop." When, from the journal of Claude Frenois, there were no refrigerators, no ventilation systems. Meat, whether lamb, boar, or beef, was left hanging at room temperature for days. Fruit often fell to the damp floor before being arranged on silver platters. And insects? They were the uninvited guests. Why didn't everyone fall sick and die? They did get sick, but it was often dismissed as having a weak constitution rather than food poisoning, diarrhea, nausea, and stomach cramps were so common, no one thought to blame the food. That's what made Versailles a living biological time bomb, said Professor Jacques Lemoyne, University of Paris. For the gravest threat? Parasites. Archaeological studies of royal burial sites confirmed that most 17th and 18th century aristocrats showed signs of intestinal worm infections, particularly tapeworms. The most infamous case, King Louis XIV once passed a tapeworm measuring 15 centimeters, and he reportedly continued to enjoy veal stew later that evening. At Versailles, the most terrifying danger wasn't being poisoned once. It was being poisoned a little every single day by the royal kitchen itself. Added Dr. Moreau, food wasn't the only vector of disease. The chefs themselves were also carriers. They didn't wash their hands after relieving themselves, or more accurately, after using shared chamber pots. Cooking tools weren't sterilized, and blood from raw meat was wiped away with dirty cloths. Dishes like rare meat, aged fish, or soft ripened cheese became miniature petri dishes, and terrifyingly, these were often the most fashionable offerings at Versailles feasts. For royal women, dining wasn't just nourishment, it was a performance. They were expected to eat gracefully, have slowly, smile politely, even while their stomachs twisted in pain. For some noble women, resisting the urge to vomit mid-banquet was considered as courtly decorum. They weren't allowed to wince, not allowed to clutch their stomach, not allowed to excuse themselves. Dying in silence was better than breaking poise, explained Professor Barron, et en experton, royal étiquette. Thus, Versailles became a place where beauty and bacteria coexisted on the same porcelain plate. They endured illness in silence. But there was one kind of pain they could not hide: childbirth. In our final section, we'll step into the most sacred and most terrifying room of all, where royal women gave birth in front of crowds, without anesthesia, without privacy, and without a choice. In the 17th century, a royal child was not just a child, it was the continuation of power, bloodline, and social order. That's why the birth of a queen or high-ranking noblewoman's child could never be private. It had to happen in front of dozens of witnesses. The Queen's birthing room wasn't a room. It was a theater, said Dr. Camille Rochefort, researcher of royal ceremonial practices in France, the memoirs of Marie de Rohan, a senior lady-in-waiting. Described the scene during Queen Marie Thyrse's labor. The room was packed. Counts, priests, doctors, ladies-in-waiting, ministers crammed so tightly that no one could move. Prayers blended with groans. Sweat poured like rain. And no one dared to look away. The reason? Fear of baby swapping. It was believed that if a birth occurred behind closed doors, there was a chance of deception, especially if the child was stillborn or a girl. To prevent rival factions from smuggling in a healthy male heir, every eye had to witness the process from start to finish. That meant the woman, even a queen, had to endure the agony of childbirth in front of a crowd. No anesthesia, no privacy, no right to object, and certainly no screaming. Maintaining dignity during childbirth was an unspoken expectation, even as those watching violated the very dignity they demanded, explained Professor Elodie Marchand, author of Birth and Shame in Royal Europe. Many mothers fainted mid-labor. Queen Marie Antoinette collapsed in the sweltering heat of her chamber, surrounded by dozens of nobles. Windows flung open, incense burning, and people jostling for a better view. It resembled a sacrificial ritual more than a birth, said Florence Delaroche, historian of ancient female rights. And it wasn't just the body that suffered. Psychological trauma was rampant. Many women experienced what we now know as postpartum depression. But in an age without that concept, they were simply labeled as weak, morally fragile, or lacking proper devotion to the nation. The cruelest reality of all? The high mortality rate. There were no antibiotics, no sterilization protocols. Doctors didn't wash their hands before assisting with birth. Because the concept of bacteria was unknown, surgical instruments, knives, clamps, scissors were reused across multiple deliveries without sterilization. Countless women died from postpartum infections, hemorrhaging, or sepsis. According to the French Institute of Historical Medicine, 1 in 3 newborns at Versailles didn't survive past the age of 3. And for the mothers, death constantly loomed somewhere between the title of queen and a noble corpse. How? So why didn't women resist? They couldn't. Successful childbirth was a political obligation, proof of loyalty, and often the only thing that could secure a woman's position at court. A queen who failed to produce a male heir was a queen easily replaced. While men fought on the battlefield, royal women fought on the birthing bed, said Dr. Rochefort. And after giving birth, there was no long recovery. The mother was wiped down with alcohol or vinegar, wrapped in linen, and expected to reappear in public within days, feverish or not, in pain or not, because preserving appearances was a duty that never ceased. At Versailles, beauty was never allowed to flinch. And so, you've walked with us through every gilded yet foul-smelling corridor, through towering wigs that crawled with life, through feasts teeming with hidden illness. And now, through moments of life and death played out like theater. Versailles was not merely a palace. It was a mosaic of dazzling appearances and decaying truths. And the women, draped in velvet, crowned in jewels, were still victims of a system where cleanliness was a sin. And power always came at the price of blood and stench. Yet, history is not written only in victories, but in sweat, in blood, and in the silent pain of those who were never allowed to tell their story.